At -71 degrees, a knock on your door doesn't mean a visitor. It usually means death. But for 72-year-old Martha, the heavy, rhythmic thud against her frost-welded cabin door wasn't the wind. It was a 400-pound Siberian tiger, bleeding, desperate, and carrying something impossible in her jaws. In the heart of the Siberian taiga, just outside the settlement of Oymyakon, widely known as the Pole of Cold, survival is not a hobby. It is a brutal, daily war against the elements. On this particular January night, the mercury had plummeted to a soul-crushing 71 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the physical world begins to break down. Trees explode as the sap violently freezes and expands inside their trunks. If you spit, your saliva turns into a solid bullet of ice before it hits the ground. Every breath taken without a thick woolen face wrap feels like inhaling shattered glass, freezing the moisture in your lungs and causing a slow, agonizing asphyxiation. Martha Higgins knew these rules better than anyone. A 72-year-old retired American wildlife biologist who had stubbornly remained in the frozen wilderness after her husband, Arthur, passed away a decade ago. She was a woman carved from the very ice that surrounded her. Her cabin, a sturdy structure of thick cedar logs sealed with dried moss and pitch, was an isolated fortress. The nearest human being was a rugged bush pilot named Thomas, who lived over 20 miles away across a frozen, impassable river. The wind howled like a choir of dying wolves, battering the cabin with blinding sheets of white snow. It was a buran, a legendary Siberian blizzard that swallowed the landscape whole, erasing the horizon and plunging the world into a chaotic, swirling darkness. Inside, however, Martha was safe. The heavy cast-iron stove in the center of the room glowed a comforting cherry red, radiating a fierce heat that kept the small living space at a livable temperature. She sat in Arthur's old leather armchair, a thick quilt draped over her lap, methodically oiling her antique Winchester .30-06 rifle by the golden light of a kerosene lamp. Then, the sound came. It wasn't the sharp, erratic rattling of the wind against the storm shutters. It was a deliberate, heavy thud. Thump. Martha's hands went completely still. She held her breath, listening to the roar of the storm outside. For a moment, she convinced herself it was just a dead branch breaking off the massive pine tree near the porch. Thump. Scratch. A low, guttural vibration followed the sound, a rumble so deep it seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly within her chest cavity. The floorboards vibrated beneath her wool-socked feet. It was a growl, but it was weak, exhausted, and strangely rhythmic. Martha's blood ran cold. Bears were deep in hibernation, buried under feet of snow. Wolves, even starving ones, did not knock. They circled, they wailed, but they avoided the terrifying scent of wood smoke and human habitation. This was something else. She stood up, her arthritic knees popping in the quiet cabin, and smoothly chambered around into the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack was deafening in the silence. She approached the heavy oak door. The lock was solid iron, frosted over with a thick layer of white rime on the inside. "Who is it?" she called out in Russian, then immediately felt foolish. No human could be out in a 71 degrees Celsius whiteout. If a person were on her porch, they wouldn't be knocking, they would be dead. Another heavy, wet gasp echoed from the other side of the wood, followed by a frantic, heavy scrape of claws against the timber. Gripping the rifle tightly in her right hand, Martha unlatched the deadbolt with her left. She braced her shoulder against the door to keep the fierce wind from blowing it wide open, and slowly pulled it inward just a fraction. The wind violently sucked the warm air out of the cabin, replacing it with a localized hurricane of blinding, razor-sharp ice crystals. Through the narrow crack, Martha squinted into the swirling vortex. Lying on her snow-swept porch, panting heavily with breath that instantly plumed into thick white clouds, was an apex predator, an Amur tiger, a massive, fully grown female. Martha stumbled back, her finger instinctively tightening on the trigger guard. The Amur tiger is the largest feline in the world. Even starving, this creature easily weighed over 400 pounds, a lethal machine of muscle, claws, and fangs. Yet, the beast did not leap at the opening. She did not roar. The mother tiger's beautiful orange and black coat was matted with thick clumps of ice and frozen blood. Her left shoulder was deeply lacerated, a jagged tear that looked suspiciously like a glancing bullet wound, but it was her eyes that made Martha slowly lower the barrel of her rifle. They were amber, enormous, and filled with a profound, terrifying desperation. The tiger looked at Martha, then slowly, agonizingly, lowered her massive head to the snow-covered porch. Between her massive, frost-bitten front paws rested an object. The tiger nudged it forward with a bloody nose, pushing it directly toward the crack in the door. Martha kicked the door open a few more inches, the freezing wind instantly numbing her face. She shined her heavy metal flashlight down at the object. It was a piece of fabric, a torn, heavily insulated sleeve from a child's winter parka, and it was soaked in fresh, unfrozen blood. Martha stood frozen, not from the 71 degrees Celsius air violently rushing into her home, but from the sheer impossibility of what lay on her porch. The tiger let out a weak, agonizing chuff, a sound tigers use to communicate with their young or signify non-aggression. She nudged the bloody child's sleeve again, pushing it over the threshold of the door, right against the tip of Martha's insulated boot. Then, the massive beast took one agonizing step backward, her golden eyes fixed unblinkingly on the old woman. "Dear God," Martha whispered, the words snatched away by the howling wind. She knew this tiger. As a former biologist, Martha had spent years tracking the local fauna. This female was known among the sparse local tracking community as Empress, a magnificent, elusive creature who usually ruled the taiga miles to the north. Empress had never ventured this close to human territory. Tigers despise humans. They avoid the smell of gasoline, wood smoke, and sweat. For a wild Amur tiger to approach a lit cabin meant the laws of nature had been entirely suspended by absolute desperation. Martha reached down with trembling fingers and picked up the torn sleeve. It was small, extremely small. It belonged to a toddler, no more than 4 or 5 years old. The material was high-grade synthetic down, bright yellow, but stained a dark, terrifying crimson. The blood was fresh enough that it hadn't yet frozen into a solid block, meaning whoever wore this was very close, and bleeding out in the most unforgiving climate on the planet. The tiger let out another low moan, turned her massive body toward the blinding whiteout, and took 2 steps into the blizzard. She stopped, looked back over her heavily muscled shoulder, and stared at Martha. "She wants me to follow her." The realization hit Martha with the force of a physical blow. To step out into a 71 degrees Celsius storm was tantamount to suicide. Visibility was less than 3 feet. The cold would penetrate the thickest layers of clothing within minutes, slowing the heart, plunging the core temperature into fatal hypothermia. Even with her extensive survival training, venturing out into a buron at night was a death sentence. But she looked at the tiny, blood-soaked yellow sleeve in her hand. Somewhere out there, a child was dying. Martha didn't hesitate. Survival instinct was entirely overridden by the fierce, maternal adrenaline that surged through her veins. "Wait," she barked at the tiger, pointing a stern, gloved finger as if commanding a domestic dog. Miraculously, Empress sat down in the snow, curling her thick, striped tail over her bleeding paws, waiting. Martha slammed the heavy oak door shut to buy herself 5 minutes. She moved with a speed and agility she hadn't possessed in a decade. She stripped off her indoor clothes and began the meticulous process of layering for extreme cold. Thermal wool base layers, a thick fleece mid-layer, insulated, heavy-duty waterproof pants, 2 pairs of thermal socks, her expedition-grade boots, rated for -80 degrees. Over it all, she donned a massive, heavy caribou skin parka, a gift from a native Yakutian friend years ago. The hood lined with thick wolverine fur which refuses to frost over from breath. She grabbed her medical kit, a heavy canvas bag stocked with trauma supplies, thermal blankets, and chemical heat packs. She strapped a headlamp over her fur hood, threw the medical bag over her shoulder, and slung the Winchester rifle across her back. Finally, she secured a thick wool scarf over her nose and mouth, leaving only a narrow slit for her goggles. When Martha reopened the door, the storm seemed to have intensified. a roaring wall of white noise and flying ice. Empress was exactly where she had left her, though a fresh layer of snow had already begun to bury the great cat. Seeing Martha emerge, the tiger stood up, shaking the snow from her coat with a violent shudder, and began to walk into the darkness. Martha followed, stepping directly into the massive paw prints the tiger left behind, which were already filling with blowing snow the moment they were pressed into the earth. The cold hit her instantly, biting aggressively at the tiny sliver of exposed skin around her goggles. It was a suffocating, heavy cold that felt like being submerged in deep, icy water. They walked for what felt like hours, though Martha knew it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The taiga was a labyrinth of towering, snow-laden pines and jagged rock formations. Empress moved with a limping, labored grace, frequently pausing to look back and ensure the slow, clumsy human was still following. The tiger's breathing was ragged. The wound on her shoulder was leaving a faint, dark trail in the snow that the storm quickly erased. Martha's chest burned. The air was too cold to breathe deeply. Her legs felt like lead, dragging through waist-deep drifts. Doubt began to creep into her mind. Am I being led into a trap? Is she just leading me to her den to feed her starving cubs? Suddenly, the tiger stopped at the base of a massive, overturned spruce tree. The roots of the fallen giant had torn up a huge chunk of earth and rock, creating a natural, cavernous overhang that was shielded from the direct fury of the wind. Empress let out a soft, chuffing sound and vanished into the darkness beneath the tangled roots. Martha unslung her rifle, her frozen fingers clumsy on the safety mechanism. She clicked on her headlamp, the bright LED beam cutting through the swirling snow and illuminating the gaping black hole under the tree. Taking a deep, painful breath, Martha crouched down and entered the den. The smell hit her first, the musky, potent scent of wild animal, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of blood. The wind dropped significantly inside the hollow, though the temperature was still lethally cold. Martha swept her light across the earthen floor. In the far corner, huddled against the dirt wall, lay Empress. The massive tiger was panting, her golden eyes watching Martha's every move, but she was not alone. Nestled tight against the mother tiger's soft, warm underbelly was a single tiger cub, no bigger than a large dog, mewling softly, and right beside the cub, wrapped violently in the tiger's protective embrace, was a small, shivering bundle of bright yellow fabric. Martha dropped to her knees, the rifle sliding uselessly into the dirt. She crawled forward, entirely forgetting the danger of the 400-pound predator looming over her. The tiger did not snap. She simply shifted her weight, exposing the yellow bundle. It was a little boy. His face was pale as porcelain, his lips a terrifying shade of blue. He was unconscious, his tiny hands tucked tightly into the tiger's fur for warmth. But as Martha reached out to touch him, the beam of her headlamp caught the horror of the situation. The boy's leg was caught in the jagged, steel jaws of a massive, illegal poacher's trap, the very trap that had likely caused the deep, bloody laceration on the mother tiger's shoulder when she had desperately and miraculously dragged the boy and the trap miles through the taiga to the safety of her den. But why? Why had a wild apex predator saved a human child from a trap meant for her own kind? Martha reached for the child's neck, praying for a pulse, as the mother tiger let out a long, sorrowful sigh and rested her massive chin on Martha's knee. Martha's thick, insulated gloves clumsily brushed the frozen, bright yellow fabric away from the little boy's neck. She pressed her bare fingertips against his icy skin, directly over the carotid artery. For 3 agonizing seconds, she felt nothing but the terrifying stillness of a corpse. Then, faint and erratic, a thready pulse fluttered against her fingers like the wings of a dying moth. He was alive, but his core temperature was plummeting toward the point of no return. Severe hypothermia was already shutting down his organs. Martha shifted her headlamp, the harsh white beam cutting through the swirling dust and snow inside the den, coming to rest on the boy's trapped leg. Bile rose in her throat. It was a massive, illegal piece of hardware, a modified #6 bear trap with serrated steel jaws, meant to shatter bone and hold a 400-pound animal in place. The trap's heavy iron chain was wrapped around a thick pine root. But as Martha looked closer, The horrific puzzle pieces of the night began to snap into place. The trap had not been set here. The chain was broken. The heavy steel links twisted and snapped by immense, unimaginable force. Martha looked at Empress. The massive tiger's left shoulder wasn't just lacerated by a bullet. It was mangled, bearing the unmistakable, jagged, parallel cuts of the trap's teeth. The mother tiger had been caught in this very trap. The poachers had likely set it near her territory. But Empress had fought, driven by the primal instinct to protect her remaining cub. She had ripped the trap from its moorings, tearing her own flesh to escape, dragging the heavy steel mechanism with her. But how did the boy end up in it? Martha gently unzipped the top of the boy's blood-stained synthetic down parka to access his chest. Inside the collar, a small, faded name tag was stitched into the lining. Leo. The breath hitched in Martha's throat. Leo. She knew that name. It was the 4-year-old grandson of Thomas, the rugged bush pilot who lived 20 miles across the frozen river. Thomas had radioed her 2 days ago, his voice crackling with static and panic, saying his daughter's car had broken down near the logging roads, and he was taking his single-engine Cessna up in the escalating winds to spot them before the Buren hit. The plane must have gone down in the whiteout. Little Leo must have wandered from the wreckage in the blinding snow, disoriented and freezing, only to stumble directly into the abandoned poacher's trap that the tiger had violently shaken off. Empress had found him. A wild Amur tiger, bleeding to death from a trap set by humans, had stumbled upon a human child caught in the very same steel jaws. Instead of seeking revenge, the grieving mother, perhaps having lost her other cubs to the poachers, recognized a helpless, dying infant. She had dragged the boy, the heavy trap, and her surviving cub through miles of unforgiving taiga to the only shelter she knew, and then, in a final act of desperate intelligence, sought out the one human she had observed living peacefully in the woods. "Okay, Leo." "Okay, sweetheart. I'm here," Martha whispered, her voice trembling but her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned biologist. First, she had to stop the bleeding. The steel teeth of the trap had punctured the boy's calf, but the freezing temperatures had paradoxically saved his life by constricting the blood vessels and slowing the hemorrhage. If she removed the trap now, the sudden release of pressure would cause massive blood loss. She reached into her medical kit, pulling out a military-grade tourniquet. She slipped it high up on Leo's thigh, just below the hip, and cranked the windlass tight until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. Next came the impossible task. She had to pry open the jaws of a trap designed to hold a grizzly bear. Martha grabbed the 2 massive steel springs on either side of the trap. She positioned her heavy boots on the lower levers and pushed down with all the strength her 72-year-old frame could muster. The steel didn't even groan. It was locked tight, frozen solid by the 71 degrees Celsius air and coagulated blood. "Damn it," she hissed, her breath pluming in the icy air. She tried again, her arthritic joints screaming in agony, her vision spotting with exertion. Nothing. She was too old, too weak, and the cold was sapping her strength by the second. She looked around the den frantically for a thick branch to use as a lever, but the earthen floor was bare. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the tight space. Martha froze. Empress was moving. The massive feline dragged her, battered, bleeding body forward, her golden eyes fixed intensely on the steel trap. Martha instinctively shrank back, gripping the handle of her hunting knife. But Empress didn't look at Martha. The tiger positioned her massive, plate-sized right paw directly over one of the heavy steel springs. Martha couldn't believe what she was seeing. "You want to help?" Martha breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Empress let out a short, sharp exhale, a cloud of steam enveloping the trap. She pressed her weight down on the spring. Okay, on 3, Martha said, tears of absolute awe and terror freezing to her eyelashes. She positioned her boots on the opposite spring, gripping the jaws of the trap with her thick gloves to pull them apart. 1, 2, 3. Martha threw her entire body weight onto the left spring. Empress, understanding the kinetic requirement with terrifying, primal intelligence, pushed down with her massive right shoulder, putting 300 pounds of raw, feline muscle onto the right spring. With a loud, horrific crack of breaking ice and rusted metal, The heavy steel jaws slowly parted. Martha didn't hesitate. She reached in, grabbed little Leo by the thigh and the boot, and yanked his mangled leg free from the iron teeth. The jaws snapped shut instantly with a deafening clang that echoed violently off the dirt walls, missing Martha's hands by a fraction of an inch. Empress collapsed backward, exhausted, her breathing now a wet, rattling gasp. Her duty to the trap was done. Martha immediately went to work on the boy. She packed the deep puncture wounds with hemostatic gauze, wrapping his calf tightly in pressure bandages. She cracked 4 chemical heat packs, placing them in the boy's armpits and groin, and then wrapped him tightly in a reflective mylar space blanket, followed by a thick woolen emergency blanket from her pack. She had to get him to the cabin. The den was at least 40 degrees Celsius. Even wrapped up, Leo's tiny body could not generate enough heat to survive the next hour. Martha turned to the tiger. Empress was lying on her side, her golden eyes half closed. The massive pool of dark blood beneath her shoulder had frozen solid. She was dying. The trek through the storm, the blood loss, and the final exertion to open the trap had taken everything she had. The single tiger cub, a fluffy ball of orange and black stripes, whined pitifully, nudging its mother's cold nose. Empress weakly raised her massive head one last time. She looked at Martha, then looked down at her cub, with a gentle, deliberate nudge of her snout. Empress pushed the crying cub directly toward Martha's knees. It was a transfer of guardianship, the ultimate sacrifice of an apex predator, entrusting her legacy to the very species that had killed her, because she recognized the soul of a mother within the old woman. "I've got him," Martha choked out, a sob finally breaking through her stoic exterior. "I promise you, I've got him." Empress let out a long, slow exhale, her golden eyes fixed on the entrance of the den, watching the swirling white snow. Then, the great Amur tiger closed her eyes, and the rhythmic rising of her massive chest stopped forever. There was no time to mourn. The brutal reality of the Siberian winter demanded absolute pragmatism. Martha slung her medical bag across her chest. She carefully picked up the unconscious Leo, cradling his bundled, fragile form against her own chest, inside the oversized folds of her caribou skin parka. His icy face rested against her neck, and she prayed to feel the shallow brush of his breath. She looked down at the orphan tiger cub. It was shivering violently, mewling for its dead mother. Martha unzipped the heavy canvas medical bag, dumped out the remaining bandages, and scooped the heavy, 30-pound cub into the bag, slinging it over her back. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. She crawled out of the den and stood up. The Buran hit her with the force of a freight train. The wind had shifted, and the temperature felt as if it had dropped even further. The darkness was absolute, save for the narrow, blinding beam of her headlamp, which reflected off millions of flying ice crystals, creating a hypnotic, disorienting tunnel of white. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of excruciating agony. Every step through the waist-deep snow required a monumental effort. Martha's lungs burned with a fiery intensity, the 71 degrees Celsius air threatening to freeze the moisture in her throat. She could no longer feel her toes. The agonizing sting in her cheeks had faded into a dangerous, wooden numbness, the unmistakable onset of severe frostbite. Left foot, right foot, breathe. She repeated the mantra in her head, leaning forward against the howling gale. The weight of the boy on her chest and the cub on her back was pulling her down into the snow. The taiga was trying to claim them. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Martha tripped over a hidden root, crashing hard into a snowdrift. She instinctively twisted her body mid-fall to protect Leo, taking the brunt of the impact on her own shoulder. Pain shot down her spine. She lay there in the snow for a moment, the overwhelming urge to sleep washing over her. It was so peaceful. The cold was no longer biting. It was a warm, heavy blanket coaxing her into oblivion. Just rest for a minute, her exhausted brain pleaded. Then, she felt it. A tiny, imperceptible twitch against her neck. Leo's frigid lips moved. Adrenaline, pure and unadulterated, flooded Martha's system. She screamed into the wind, a primal roar of defiance, and forced herself onto her hands and knees. She stood up, staggering, driven purely by the ghost of Arthur, the memory of her own miscarriages years ago, and the ultimate sacrifice of the tiger left behind in the den. Through the roaring white chaos, a faint, amber glow appeared. It was the frosted window of her cabin. Martha practically fell onto the porch. She fumbled violently with the heavy iron latch, her frozen, useless fingers unable to grip the metal. With a desperate cry, she kicked the door with her heavy boot. It swung open, and she spilled onto the wooden floorboards, the wind howling violently as it rushed inside. She kicked the door shut, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place, sealing them in the warm, quiet sanctuary of the cabin. The cast iron stove had burned down to glowing embers, but the cabin was still a miraculous 20 degrees Celsius above freezing. Martha collapsed on the rug, frantically unwrapping Leo. She carried him to the bed, piling every quilt, blanket, and pelt she owned over him. She checked the tourniquet, slightly loosening it to allow a trickle of blood flow, saving the limb from total necrosis. Then, she opened the canvas bag. The tiger cub tumbled out, shaking violently, its fur matted with snow. Martha pulled a heavy wool sweater from her trunk, wrapped the cub tightly, and placed it on the hearth rug directly in front of the stove. For the next 10 hours, as the blizzard raged outside, tearing at the roof and rattling the heavy storm shutters, Martha fought a microscopic war against death. She heated water, filling old glass bottles to place around Leo's torso. She crushed a broad-spectrum antibiotic from her kit and managed to get him to swallow it with drops of warm sugar water. She thawed frozen caribou meat, chewing it herself before feeding it to the starving tiger cub, who accepted it with weak, desperate licks. By dawn, the howling wind finally began to die down, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence. Martha sat in the leather armchair, staring blankly at the stove. Her hands were blistered and swollen from frostnip, her face an angry, bruised purple. From beneath the mountain of quilts on the bed, a tiny voice cracked the silence. "Mama?" Martha closed her eyes, tears spilling hot and fast down her frozen cheeks. Leo's eyes were open. He was pale, incredibly weak, but his gaze was lucid. He was alive. Martha immediately limped to the shortwave radio on her desk. She flipped the heavy toggle switch, adjusting the frequency to the emergency channel used by the local scattered settlements. "Oymyakan Base, this is Martha Higgins. Do you copy? Over." Static hissed violently for a long minute. Then, a panicked, exhausted voice broke through. "Martha? This is Officer David Miller. We have an active search. Thomas's plane went down. We found the wreckage an hour ago. Thomas is injured but alive. But his grandson, Leo, he's gone. He wandered off. We're organizing a recovery." The officer's voice broke. "David, listen to me," Martha said, her voice steady and echoing with the weight of the night. "Call off the recovery. Get Thomas on a snowcat and get a medic out here immediately. I have Leo. He's hurt, but he is alive." The radio went dead silent. "Martha, how?" The trackers said there were massive predator tracks at the crash site. A tiger, they thought. Martha looked down at the hearth rug. The orange and black cub was curled into a tight ball, sleeping peacefully in the radiant heat of the stove, a living testament to an impossible truth. The trackers were wrong. "David," Martha said softly, looking out the frosted window at the endless, brilliant white expanse of the Siberian morning. "The tiger didn't take him. She saved him." The survival of little Leo defied every law of the frozen taiga, a miracle born in 71 degrees Celsius darkness. Empress's extraordinary sacrifice proved that the fierce, protective bounds of motherhood transcend species, bridging the gap between apex predator and human. Today, a thriving Amur tiger roams a protected sanctuary, a living legacy of a mother's ultimate gift, forever binding a boy, an old woman, and the wild Siberian ice.